Oh.
Joining us now in the studio, our good friend, the president of Empower Mississippi, Mr. Russ Latino. Good afternoon, Russ. Thanks for joining us
Thanks
today.
for having me.
Now, I know you've been a frequent guest on the program before I started filling in for JT, and you've also guest hosted many times here at the network as well. But you knew JT.
Knew him very well. Thought the world of him. I was a young lawyer, probably about 3 years out of law school the first time I ever came on. I think that was about 2008.
Wow.
It was right in the midst of what was a great period of upheaval in our nation with President Obama getting elected and really sort of a sea change in the way that people were thinking about the role of government, which made for great conservative talk radio. And he let a young guy come on and share his opinions, and we developed a good relationship. We had, I say we had some friendly disagreements over the years, but it was always fun being on with him. He always was one of those guys that I thought came at an issue with a lot of common sense. I called it country common sense,
Yep.
And I think it was really relatable. He's somebody that will be missed, and prayers go out to his family and really this audience, because I said in a Facebook post, in a lot of ways, the listening audience probably considered JT part of their family. He was just one of those kind of guys.
That's absolutely right, and invited him, so to speak, into their home every single day for a long time, and what a relationship that he built statewide. Really incredible. We shall certainly miss him, but appreciate those remarks, Russ. So before I ask you a question, I wanted to follow up with something I said right before we went to the break, and that's the situation in Kansas City. So they have determined, in their infinite wisdom, that about 80% of personal electric vehicle charging occurs at home, usually in a garage or a carport. Well, to help the homeless, which they deem to be mostly minorities, they are going to install electric vehicle chargers on light poles in the city so that the homeless can plug their electric vehicle into charge.
It's theater of the absurd. It's interesting because I was listening to you before I came in, and you're just talking about some of the craziness that's coming out of Washington. But I feel like in a lot of ways we are being led by crazy people, right? I mean, like I'm trying to think a diplomatic way to say it, but we're not a serious people anymore. And Bill Maher, who I don't agree with on very much of anything, but on his program, he went through sort of this analysis about how we are like trying to be offended. Like everything we see, we do navel gazing over. It's like, how is this offensive to me? And you can come up with something, right? But his whole thing was we're no longer a serious people. And because we're allowing ourselves to be so distracted by these absurd things, like will a homeless person be offended if he can't plug in his Tesla? Newsflash, he doesn't own one.
Unbelievable.
Right? That countries like China and other countries are going to end up whooping our butts.
I agree.
Because we're just not operating as a serious people anymore.
I agree. So we are infiltrating our schools, for example, with all this social justice training, yet we're 37th in the world in math, right? And China's just saying, those idiot Americans, they're focused on that. Here's more math, that we're gonna do over here. By the way, Kansas City said that they're doing this because there are millions of Americans and thousands, I guess, in Kansas City who don't have garages. So that's their justification for this. I mean, to your point about just being crazy, do you think to some extent our hyper media, because our media consists not only of traditional media, and there's lots of that now, that's expanded, but social media, is this box checking? Is this self-aggrandizing? Is this self-gratification to a great extent? Look what I did. I got charging receptacles to the homeless.
No, I think there's probably some truth to that. The fact is that the American public apparently likes to be outraged. And
that's right.
And I draw some similarities between us and Rome, right? When you think about free bread and gladiator games, is how you distracted people from the real things that mattered to their lives.
Yeah.
And so there's just this constant cycle of distraction on these little things that get people fired up. And I don't think people realize, okay, I was really angry about this 15 minutes ago, and now I'm really angry about something else. maybe what I was really angry about 15 minutes ago wasn't actually that big of a deal. Like, maybe I should step off the box for a second, take a good view of my life and say there are more important things out here. But no, I just think we've ceased to be a serious people, that we're easily distracted.
Well, it's a great point, and I think to some extent it relates to this particular situation in Kansas City. Shouldn't we be worried about, I don't know, a place for these people to live and eat, and what our society can do to create more opportunity and figure out what the root cause of that is? Not, here's a charging station. That's just nuts.
So there was a comedian who's dead now named Mitch Hedberg, and he had this joke, and it seems apt right now, but he was talking about how he was walking down the street and he was waving at people, and then he had this moment of guilt where he was like, what if I am waving at someone that doesn't have a hand, right? So I can't wave at people anymore because I might wave at someone who's offended by the fact that I have a hand. And it feels very similar to this scenario, right? It's like, yeah, we got to have charging stations for people who don't own Teslas. Otherwise, they'll be offended that we presume that they didn't own a Tesla.
Whoa.
Anyway.
I know we're off on a rant there, but, I like to say frequently on the program, the great thing about this country is you have the right to offend, but you do not have the right to not be offended. And as long as we think that is a right, then we're going to continue to make stupid policy like this.
Or you can simply choose not to be offended.
Well, sure. We don't teach that anymore.
Just, okay, whatever.
In fact, we teach just the opposite. You got to be offended by this.
Sure.
Wrong pronoun. Oh, my gosh, all hell breaks loose. Oh, my. All right. So I know you to be a prolific researcher and analyst when it comes to all these wonky sorts of spending matters and economic situations and just policy in general. And I share that love with you, as you know. And so you penned an article recently that caught my attention, I thought was excellent, and it details how money, COVID relief spending, has occurred in Mississippi, money that was appropriated for that purpose that was just, as I like to say, dropped out of helicopters from the federal government across our country. And Mississippi received a bunch of it, and it's not just, as most people think, that this money that went directly to governments or government agencies. There's a bunch of that, but there's lots of other money as well. But you did a nice list here of that and compilation of where all that money went. You're showing $36 billion. That's over the last year, right?
Yeah, $36.3 billion since last March. Yeah, it's a lot of money. I'll tell you how this started, though. Okay. So when I was still in D.C., I started doing research right around when COVID kicked off. And what I was curious about was what's the impact of crisis spending on long-term growth of government, right? As a conservative, I believe in small government. I think small government is what allows there to be freedom. I think freedom is what allows there to be innovation and prosperity. And so I was just kind of curious, what's the impact of crisis spending long-term? And so I started back in World War I, which is what led us to have an income tax. We didn't have a federal income tax before that. And looked at World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War, 9/11, and then the financial crisis. And you often hear people say, well, federal spending has just been exploding, whether it's a Republican or Democrat in office, and that's true. But what you actually see are these incredible spikes around crises. So literally in each one of those cases, massive increases in the amount that was getting spent. But then as soon as the crisis was over, it never ratcheted back. Right? It stayed at that level. And so that was my curiosity. And then I think the second part of it was I kept hearing people say, oh, the U.S. is just, it's just providing for the fat cats. It's just giving money to Wall Street. It's not really taking care of the mom and pop that are hurting. And certainly a lot of people were hurt by some of the government decisions that were getting made. But I was just kind of curious, well, is that true?
Yeah.
And the numbers bear out an incredible amount of money has been sent to regular Joes and small businesses across the state of Mississippi and across the country.
We'll talk some more about this when we come back after this break. Stay with us. Russ Latino, president of Empower Mississippi, is our guest in the studio. So we were just talking, besides all these the direct government monies that went to our state to allocate out. We got a $1.25 billion, I think, is part of the CARES Act, and money that went direct to agencies. Lots of other money found its way into the public.
A ton of money. So it's $36.3 billion overall that has been allocated, right? Not all of it's been actually dispersed, but that's been allocated. To put that into context, in 2019, so pre-COVID, the entire economy of the state of Mississippi was $115 billion. So we're talking about the federal government in 1 year sending on top of our economy $31 billion in aid, or $36.3 billion in aid. It's about 31% of our normal economy. It's massive. So yeah, the largest amounts were loan programs. So that's PPP and some of the big business loans, about $8 billion. Direct payments were just the stimulus checks that you received, or some people received, depending on their income levels. That was about another $8 billion. Income support, which was the enhanced unemployment. Was $5 billion. About $3 billion on health spending. State and local government got $7.68 billion total. So you've got the $1.25 you mentioned from CARES. ARP sent $2.75 billion, which was Joe Biden's American Rescue Plan. $837 million in Medicaid matching funds. About $200.
That's right, because they increased the match.
Yeah.
Good point.
About $200 million in infrastructure and transit grants, and then $2.63 billion in additional education funds. I want to put that number in context. The state of Mississippi spends in a year on K-12 education about $2.5 billion. So literally in a year, the federal government said, here, double what you normally spend.
Right.
And if I'm a citizen listening to all these numbers, one, I know your eyeballs sort of glaze over because it seems surreal. But what you need to know is there's a tremendous amount of money floating around in the state of Mississippi, courtesy of taxpayers and future taxpayers, thanks to the amount of debt that's been incurred over the last year. And there needs to be a framework for how that money gets spent. There needs to be accountability around how that money gets spent. You'll remember Katrina, Gerard.
Sure.
Just a tremendous amount of money gets dumped on the state of Mississippi, and after the fact, we find out there's a lot of fraud, a lot of waste. This will put Katrina to shame if people aren't careful about how this money ultimately gets used.
You know, I have a saying that sort of came up with a long time ago, which is where there's big government money, there's big fraud, waste, and abuse. There is. So it's the unemployment benefits, for example. I heard Stephen Moore, economist, that's been on the program before. I know you know Stephen well as well, and worked in the Trump administration. Anyhow, he calculates that about $50 billion of unemployment fraud from the federal unemployment perspective has occurred over the last year. The state of Maryland, I read a report the other day, $2.5 billion in that state of unemployment fraud, 500,000 fraudulent cases, 500,000, which just blew me away. I don't know what the population of Maryland is, probably 6-7 million, something like that, but maybe not quite that much. But nonetheless, we're doing it at such a fast clip that accountability becomes even more difficult. We don't have enough resources to account for it all.
Yeah, some of the initial spending, you could at least make a case that the waste was a necessary component to be able to get into people's hands fast enough. In a hurry,
yeah.
If you literally had people who were being told by the government, you can't work anymore, right? So that's different than a welfare program at that point. It's sort of a regulatory taking, and there's an argument at least to be made there. I think now, though, it's very important that there be deliberate thought and deliberate frameworks that go into how this money gets spent. The unemployment benefits is one of those things that is difficult to assess how much damage that did to our economy. When you had 2/3 of the people collecting those enhanced benefits making more than they had made when they were working, and a full 1/5 doubling or more than doubling the amount that they were making when they were working, we were creating incredible disincentives. I'll give you an anecdote, and I don't believe that anecdotes are necessarily evidence, but it's a good one. So I'm leaving a hotel in New Orleans, and there's a valet, and so I'm waiting on my car. And one of the guys is talking to his supervisor and says, I got to check out at 11 today. I can't stay and work the whole day. The supervisor says, we really need you today. Like, we need you to be working. What's up? He says, well, if I work past 11, I'm not going to collect my unemployment benefits. Sitting right there. And I'm like, man, this is just a key indicator of the kind of perverse incentives that get created and how people internalize them. I can't fault that guy. I can fault the system because the system is broken, right? The system encourages that kind of activity and ultimately slows our economy.
I have a friend here in town. I mean, I guess you could call it anecdotal, but runs a pretty big healthcare institution. He said on July 15th, the day that these monthly child tax credit payments went out, that day, 6 people resigned. And they cited that as the reason. I don't need to work anymore. I got the child tax payments coming in. So,
well, that's over $1 billion in Mississippi just from the change, right?
Unbelievable.
That's over $1 billion additional dollars in Mississippi just because of the change. Well, if you're a parent, you're like, oh, great, I'm getting these payments now. But we are slowly making everyone dependent on government.
Yep.
I remember having this argument once, and Gerard, forgive me, but having this argument once in D.C. with some folks who were center-left and talking about Social Security reforms. And I said, why don't we just take Charles Koch and Warren Buffett and all these guys and say, you're not going to get a Social Security check, right? You paid in. It was a tax on you. You don't need it. We're gonna eliminate those people who don't need Social Security, which is means testing, right?
Yep.
And they were vehemently against this idea. And it's not because they want Charles Koch to get a check from the government. It's because they want everyone to be dependent on the government. They want to foster an atmosphere of dependency. And I think, one, that's anathema to what it takes for a country to be successful. And two, it's putting us on a path where we're committed to intergenerational theft. I mean, we're telling future generations we're borrowing against your future.
I saw a split-screen discussion. Ken Langone, one of the co-founders of Home Depot, a conservative-minded business leader, and Elizabeth Warren. And he told her, he said, Senator, quit sending me Social Security checks. Yeah. I mean, he's worth several $100 million. And she never responded. I didn't understand why. Yet, she was really all about imposing a wealth tax. And he was arguing against a wealth tax, of course. And he said, he said it so eloquently, I risked all my money when I had nothing to achieve this wealth. Now you want to take it from me.
Yeah, because the underlying philosophy is that there is no private property ownership, right? What you do belongs to us, and then we decide how to spend it on you. It is just the antithesis of a free market in a free country. And I don't think people realize that that's sort of what's guiding that policy train. On the flip side, conservatives have to get a lot better at explaining their point of view, because if it sounds like we're compassionate and we're caring about people, and it sounds like you guys are just, throwing out numbers, then we probably don't get very far.
Our messaging's got to improve. I think I say it all the time. We're not really good at selling freedom and free markets and economic freedom. We got to do better at that. We're sort of getting whitewashed, I think, by those on the left who are really good at selling government dependency. So you're probably familiar with a recent article by the Center for Public Policy where they called out the fat cats, as they call it, which listed a number of public sector employees in the state that make a lot of money, and listed those in the report. What do you think about that?
I think that it's an interesting compilation of data. I think that the public, taxpayers, have a right to know how the money that they earn and ultimately send to government gets spent. It's one of those things that requires some context, though, right? And so I'm a small government guy. I believe in freedom. I think that historically, conservatives haven't always done a great job of explaining how that philosophy helps people.
Yeah.
And if you look at the situation there, the context that's required is how much does the superintendent for schools, as an example, get paid in other places? Because we got to be able to recruit them.
Let's continue this after the break. All right. We got Russ Latino, president of Empower Mississippi, in the studio. The JT. All right, Russ Latino, president of Empower Mississippi, is our guest. So, Russ, please continue your conversation about this so-called fat cat report. And you were just talking about keeping things in context with respect to the high pay of some of these superintendents and so forth.
Yeah, well, I think what I was saying before the break is it's useful information, and taxpayers deserve to know how people are getting paid, how their money is getting spent. The context part of the conversation, because most of the people listed were school superintendents.
Yes.
For me, it's, okay, what are their responsibilities, right? If you have a CEO of a $34 million company and they have 1,000 employees, and it's their role to make sure that that ship operates and doesn't run aground, that person is likely going to be compensated highly. And so if you look at DeSoto County as an example, 34,000 students, if you do the math, about $10,000 per student is sort of the number that we're spending pre-COVID money. We're talking about a $34 million operation, give or take. That's a significant amount of management. There's a certain skill level involved in that. You were the CEO of a very large tech company. There's a certain amount of responsibility and skill level built into that where that person is going to be compensated highly for you to have someone who is at least sufficient for the job. I think the other thing, and this sort of follows that, is what do other superintendents make in other markets? Because at the end of the day, if you're hiring someone in a market where there's competition for that person's services, especially if it's a specialized service.
Right.
And so, you go and you do the sort of research, and what you see is that Mississippi superintendents are making at or below the median salaries of their counterparts across the country. And so you look at those two things and you say, well, maybe these salaries seem high, but maybe they're not actually high. And the more nuanced way to look at it would be to say, what is the result, right? What are they delivering in exchange?
It's what we do in the private sector.
It's what happens in the private sector. And I have a very similar view. Some of our state agencies are arranged in a way under the personnel board where they literally are told you got a cap on how much you can spend on certain kinds of employees.
Right.
So, if you're an attorney and you're going to work at the AG's office or the Secretaries of State's office, there's a cap on how much you can get paid that is substantially below the market rate. Substantially below the market rate. That doesn't mean there aren't some fine attorneys who have decided that they want to be in those positions.
Sure.
But they're constantly losing people from those positions and constantly having to retrain because you're not competitive for what a quality attorney could make outside of one of those jobs. And so I would look at it and say, no, it doesn't mean that we need to spend a whole lot more money on personnel. It means that we need to trust people in those positions so that if the AG or the Secretary of State say, hey, my personnel budget is X, I get to decide within that budget how to pay people so that I have quality people. And the analogy that I've used is you could hire Leonardo da Vinci for $500,000 to paint a picture, or you can hire 50 kindergartners to do finger paint. And the fact that you have 50 of them, they will never duplicate what you got out of Leonardo da Vinci. Now, that's an absurd analogy, but it's one that's absurd on purpose because there are different skill levels, and different skill levels bring different compensation. And there's a point at which a pack of people, low paid, cannot do the same work as somebody that has specialization. And so at some level, I think we've got to recognize there are beneficial roles of government. There are parts of government that need to be operational and efficient. And the way to do that is not by creating more bureaucracy. The way to do that is by creating parameters and then allowing the people who we put in positions, elected people like Secretary Watson or A.G. Fitch, to make decisions about how to do their job well and ultimately hold them accountable at the ballot box.
And along those lines, this report, and I think to a great extent the public, tend to focus on the individuals. In this case, superintendents, the superintendent of the Department of Education, the chief superintendent. We've got, 120 some odd school districts, I believe. I don't remember the exact number, but they're more than there are counties. And what's always kind of been striking to me is the difference in the organizational models across those districts. Why is it that some that don't perform so well seem to have an outsized number of staff and more overhead than those that perform better? shouldn't we be sharing best practices? And maybe they are, and I'm just not aware of it. But it seems like there ought to be, well, this is like what the template is for the best operating model.
So you had Lee Childress on earlier
from Corinth,
and I think he's a great superintendent. I think he's probably one of the most innovative minds in the education space in the state of Mississippi. Lee, coincidentally, is the highest paid superintendent on that district superintendent on that list.
Yep.
Lee's district also doesn't score very well often on the state accountability standard. Well, why is that? Because he's applied to be a district of innovation, 1 of 10 in the state, and he doesn't follow the Mississippi testing protocol. So he ends up getting marked down, even though he's graduating more kids and putting more kids in college than a lot of people who are scoring higher than him.
Yep.
And so part of it is we've designed a system that doesn't allow for experimentation and innovation the way that Lee is experimenting and innovating.
Yep.
And we score people in a way that doesn't recognize that, hey, they're not even doing this thing that we're scoring them on. Or they've done a modified version of this thing that we're scoring on, so it's really an invalid score.
Yeah.
Well, it creates a disincentive for people to do that, because who wants to go explain to their school board the reason that we're a C this year is because I said to heck with that, and by the way, we're graduating more people and more people are going to college.
It's like we're measuring the wrong thing. The KPIs we're applying here really aren't appropriate.
That's a key performance indicator. Like, wow, you're such a CEO.
Well, I got paid to do that.
The lingo with the KPI.
And I apologize for that. It wasn't intended to.
No, but you're right.
It's true, though.
We're confusing the measurement with the goal. And the goal is preparing kids for life. And I would look at someone like Lee and say, at a minimum, he's shaking it up and disrupting and trying new things to get the most out of the kids in his district. And candidly, that's probably worth more than someone who's just checking boxes.
Well, it is. I mean, that's the outcome we should be seeking, not how well you do on test scores. And tests that are made, I don't know, to some extent it seems like in a vacuum, that really aren't even a valid measurement of intellect and accomplishment and achievement. You know, and I could take it a step further, Russ. Perhaps at some point, even the K through 12 districts ought to track the adult outcomes. Once the student graduates from school, they go to college. What happens after college? When they start working, and what sorts of income and economic outcomes are they achieving? You can, to some extent, connect that to the quality or lack thereof of their education in the formative years. You certainly can.
No doubt, no doubt. And I think that's the way that at Empower we're trying to track education performance. It's going to take a little while to get the data, but it really is about how many kids are getting a job.
Yeah, exactly.
How many kids are finding fulfillment in their job? Those sorts of questions are more indicative of the quality of an education than, they scored X on an NAEP test. Now, there's nothing wrong with testing to see where progress is, but I think we often confuse a measurement tool with the actual objective.
Or I totally agree. Or, well, we sent this many, that's the big one, this many to college, but they're majoring in Russian prose or something, and they get out and they got $100,000 in debt and they can't get a job.
I was talking to somebody yesterday about this. I was like, I went to Tulane for undergrad, and I had a bunch of friends that were paying full freight, and they were paying $40,000 a year to get out and have a $40,000 a year job. So if you're just thinking about it from an ROI standpoint, from a business standpoint, right? It's an insane investment. There's all sorts of stuff we could talk about there. If I can just say one more thing around the idea that we started with, which is all this money that's in Mississippi. I mean, one, if I'm a state leader, I should be very concerned about how do we track this money and make sure it doesn't get wasted. Two, it can't end up being spent on recurring things. All that does is elevate the budget in a way that's unsustainable. Three, and I've heard some people make suggestions like this, let's take this pot of money and let's divvy it up between the 82 counties. There couldn't be a more frivolous way to waste something that I would argue we probably didn't need in the first place. But if we've got it, let's use it on big capital expenditures that we wouldn't otherwise be able to deal with. Let's spend it on the biggest problems that we've got as a state. And on the education pot, let's spend it in a way that ensures that there's more innovation, more experimentation, and that we can cover some of the learning gaps that have been created by COVID, not on recurring expenses.
Completely agree. Also, Willie and Carnes on the C Spire text line says we need a voucher program in order for parents to take money from the public schools, and the money follows the child. I mean, this is the essence of what Empower was founded on, right?
Yeah,
so we agree.
That education has to be student-centered.
We agree. Thanks for joining us, Russ. We'll be back with the final segment on the JT Show after